Hey, what's up friends? Baldwin here. Welcome back to another speech breakdown here on the Speaker Lab YouTube channel. We're glad that you're here, glad that you're joining us. Today we're going to be taking a TED Talk from Adam Grant where he's going to be doing a data-centric, data-heavy talk about the differences between givers and takers. Now there's a few things that he does well, a couple things he can improve on. We're going to talk about the importance of pacing and pauses. We're also going to be talking about how you can use humor throughout your talk. Also going to be talking about how to make sure you're not super robotic in your presentation and just regurgitating a script. So a lot to get into, a lot to break down. This is my first time seeing this, so let's break it down.
So I want you to look around the room for a minute and try to find the most paranoid person here. And then I want you to point.
All right, good pause right there. So when you're gonna do a line like that where you're expecting some type of laugh, you wanna give the audience a chance to respond. So when you say something like that, pause, give it a second. The other thing that you can do is whenever you're coming out, and especially with this being your first line, the audience has no idea whether this is supposed to be funny or sad or entertaining or inspirational. They have no idea where this talk is going to go. So when you deliver that first line, one of the things that you can do to kind of cue the audience that this is meant to be a joke and meant to be something that you can laugh at and respond to, you could give them a small little smirk, a little smile, just to kind of let them know that, hey, it's okay, you can relax, you can, this is meant to be funny. So a simple thing like that helps to break the ice right out of the gate.
Point at that person for me. Okay, don't actually do it.
What did you say?
But as an and then I want you to point at that person for me.
I'll point at the person.
Okay, don't actually do it. But as an organizational psychologist, I spent...
Now, again, good little pauses there. How many of you know someone who's the most paranoid person? All right, pause, point at that person, pause, okay, don't actually do it, pause. And each one of those are little beats that also give the audience an opportunity to laugh and respond to what he just said.
A lot of time in workplaces, and I find paranoia everywhere. Paranoia is caused by people that I call takers. Takers are self-serving in their interactions. It's all about what can you do for me? The opposite is a giver. It's somebody who approaches most interactions by asking, what can I do for you? And I wanted to give you a chance to think about your own style. We all have moments of giving and taking. Your style is just how you treat most of the people most of the time, your default. So I have a short test that you can take to figure out if you're more of a giver or a taker, and you can take it right now.
Okay, so there's a couple of ways to go about this. He's showing a slide, he's pausing long enough where he's assuming that the audience is just going to read it. Now, you can certainly do this, and what happens is people are kind of reading at their own pace and they're getting it at their own pace, right? And so what happens is you'll start to hear some people laugh, hear some more people laugh, some more people laugh, and people are starting to respond to it as they get to whatever the punchline may be. Now, I haven't actually read this yet myself. The other thing you can do is you can pull it up, give the audience a second, and then read it with them, all right? And kind of walk them through it. And so you'll hear some of the same thing of people kind of laughing a little bit along the way, but the bulk of it will happen as he would read it, as the speaker would read it. So that tends to be what I would recommend, is that as the speaker that you would take a quick second for the audience to maybe skim it, and then you would actually read this with them and out loud. And that they would, so and like in this case, if I just pulled up the slide, all right, you can see at the top it says the narcissist test. You might pause there, give a chance for people to laugh so they realize this is meant to be funny. Step one, take a moment to think about yourself. Step two, if you made it to step two, you are not a narcissist, right? And so reading that out loud then, it gives the audience the collective experience of laughing and experiencing it together versus a bunch of individuals reading it on their own.
This is the only thing I will say today that has no data behind it, but I am convinced the longer it takes you to laugh at this cartoon, the more worried we should be that you're a taker. Of course, not all takers are narcissists. Some are just givers who got burned one too many times. And then there's another kind of taker that we won't be addressing today, and that's called a psychopath. I was curious though.
Now again, this is one of those lines that could be construed as either funny or maybe he's meant to be as serious. because of everything he's done thus far, where he's given the audience a lot of opportunities to laugh, then by the time that he gets to this point and gives that line, people are going to assume that it's meant to be funny, and so they're going to respond that way. So keep in mind of when you're using humor, the reaction that you're going to get from the audience to what was meant to be a joke is oftentimes going to depend on everything that's happened thus far in the talk. So if you've presented lots of humor already, then they're going to assume that this is probably meant to be funny as well. If he hasn't said a single funny thing so far, and this is the first thing that was meant to be a joke, then it's probably not going to get as much of a reaction because of kind of the precedent he's set so far.
At how common these extremes are. And so I surveyed over 30,000 people across industries around the world's cultures. And I found that most people are right in the middle between giving and taking. They choose this third style called matching. If you're a matcher, you try to keep an even balance of give and take, quid pro quo. I'll do something for you if you do something for me. And that seems like a safe way to live your life. But is it the most effective and productive way to live your life? The answer to that question is a very definitive maybe. Now, I studied dozens of organizations, thousands of people. I had engineers measuring their productivity. I looked at medical students.
Now, this is a good example of where he is using humor via slides, but he doesn't necessarily have to comment on it. Now, this is different, right? Because there's nothing to read. He's just putting up an image that corresponds with what it is that he's talking about. So by doing that, it gives him the opportunity to continue talking, the audience to respond to it, and he can continue moving on. So good job here.
Grades, even salespeople's revenue. And unexpectedly, the worst performers in each of these jobs were the givers. The engineers who got the least work done were the ones who did more favors than they got back. They were so busy doing other people's jobs, they literally ran out of time and energy to get their own work completed. In medical school, the lowest grades belong to the students who agree most strongly with statements like, "I love helping others," which suggests the doctor you ought to trust is the one who came to med school with no desire to help anybody. And then in sales, too, the lowest revenue accrued to the most generous salespeople. And I actually reached out to one of those salespeople who had a very high giver score. And I asked him, why do you suck at your job? I didn't ask it that way, but what's the cost of generosity in sales? And he said, well, I just care so deeply about my customers that I would never sell them one of our crappy products. So just out of curiosity, how many of you self-identify more as givers than takers or matchers? Raise your hands. Okay, would have been more before we talked about these data. But actually, it turns out there's a twist here, because givers are often sacrificing themselves, but they make their organization.
Now, one observation here with this talk is it feels a little bit robotic to me, right? Now, granted, whenever you're doing a TED Talk like this, it is meant to be very, very scripted and very, very timed out, right? So this isn't something where he's just going to come up with a couple of ideas or a couple of thoughts and just kind of spitball off the top of his head. I would not recommend that, especially in this environment. But it's very possible to take a scripted talk and make it sound very, very scripted versus taking a scripted talk, and even though it is scripted and planned out and rehearsed heavily, that still makes it feel very comfortable and very natural. The more comfortable, the more confident you are with the material, the more naturally it's going to come out from you. So when it comes across scripted and robotic, it can be a bit of a disconnect for the audience because it feels like he's just kind of regurgitating something right now. If something popped up within the room, if there was a fire alarm that went off, that some type of distraction, he would probably have a little bit of a difficult time getting back on track because he's just going line by line by line. So again, it's just something to be aware of when you're speaking, and especially in this environment, you still want to be prepared, you still want to be practiced and rehearsed, and all that stuff is very, very important, and you want to have it scripted and dialed in, but also allow a little bit of space there for spontaneity and a little bit of room, or make sure that you're practiced enough that you feel comfortable delivering it and that you're not so deep in your own head.
Better. We have a huge body of evidence, many studies, looking at the frequency of giving behavior that exists in a team or an organization. And the more often people are helping and sharing their knowledge and providing mentoring, the better organizations do on every metric we can measure. Higher profits, customer satisfaction, employee retention, even lower operating expenses. So givers spend a lot of time trying to help other people and improve the team, and then unfortunately they suffer along the way. And I want to talk about what it takes to build cultures where givers actually get to succeed. So I wondered then, if givers are the worst performers, who are the best performers? And let me start with the good news. It's not the takers. Takers tend to rise quickly, but also fall quickly in most jobs. And they fall at the hands of matchers. If you're a matcher, you believe in an eye for an eye, a just world. And so when you meet a taker, you feel like it's your mission in life to just punish the hell out of that person. And that way justice gets served. Well, most people are matchers, and that means if you're a taker, it tends to catch up with you eventually. What goes around will come around. And so the logical conclusion is it must be the matchers who are the best performers. But they're not. In every job, in every organization I've ever studied, the best results belong to the givers again. So take a look at some data that I gathered from hundreds of salespeople tracking their revenue. What you can see is that the givers go...
What you might consider doing here is he's using these words, giver, taker, matcher, very quickly, right? So I found it a little bit difficult to follow exactly the logic and the train of thought there. So you can do a couple different things there. One is if you're doing something like this and you're going giver, taker, matcher, this person likes this, if you're doing something like that, one is you could have some type of diagram or some type of, and it could be something as silly as like stick figures that you put up on the screen there to just kind of illustrate what exactly it is that you're talking about, right? So Tom is a giver, and Sue is a taker, and Betty is a matcher, right? And he's kind of explaining through that, right? Another thing that he could do is he could actually bring 3 people up on stage and say, this is the giver, this is the taker, this is the matcher, so people can visually see what that looks like, and kind of he can talk about different scenarios where this might play out, kind of what he just described there, right? Another thing he could do is as he's going through this, he could slow down his pace or even pause to allow the audience the opportunity to think and digest what he just said. Because remember, the faster you talk without any pauses, the audience is trying to comprehend what you just said and still listen to the next thing that you're talking about. So when you pause and when you slow down, it gives them the opportunity to, okay, let me process that. Okay, I'm with you, I'm tracking. Now he continues, right? So that's one of the things to be aware of as when you're talking about something that's a little bit deeper, is give the audience an opportunity to digest and understand what it is that you're talking about before you proceed on.
Go to both extremes. They make up the majority of the people who bring in the lowest revenue, but also the highest revenue. And the same patterns were true for engineers' productivity and medical students' grades. Givers are overrepresented at the bottom and at the top of every success metric that I can track. Which raises the question, how do we create a world where more of these givers get to excel? And I want to talk about how to do that not just in businesses, but also in nonprofits, schools, even governments. Are you ready? All right, I was going to do it anyway, but I appreciate the enthusiasm. The first thing...
Okay, good line there. So when you have a reaction like that, that you're kind of expecting, you're hoping for a bigger reaction. My guess is that's probably a line that he's used before, and he's probably got a similar reaction, and that's probably a line that he was already planning on using either way. So be prepared whenever you're doing some type of audience interaction and you don't get the kind of response that you were hoping for, to be ready to play it off with some type of casual line like that. So that was well done by him.
The first thing that's really critical is to recognize that givers are your most valuable people, but if they're not careful, they burn out. So you have to protect the givers in your midst. And I learned a great lesson about this from Fortune's best networker. It's the guy, not the cat. His name is Adam Rifkin. He's a very successful serial entrepreneur who spends a huge amount of his time helping other people. And his secret weapon is the 5-minute favor. Adam said, look, you don't have to be Mother Teresa or Gandhi to be a giver. You just have to find small ways to add large value to other people's lives. And that could be as simple as making an introduction between 2 people who could benefit from knowing each other. It could be sharing your knowledge or giving a little bit of feedback. Or it might be even something as basic as saying, I'm going to try to figure out if I can recognize somebody whose work who has gone unnoticed. And those 5-minute favors are really critical to helping givers set boundaries and protect themselves. And the second thing that matters, if you want to build a culture where givers succeed, is you actually need a culture where help seeking is the norm, where people ask a lot. This may hit a little too close to home for some of you.
So again, he could read that, right? But he doesn't read that, so it gives the audience the chance. They have to read it on their own, and everybody reacts to it differently or responds to it with a different timing there.
What you see with successful givers is they recognize that it's okay to be a receiver too. And if you run an organization, we can actually make this easier. We can make it easier for people to ask for help. A couple of colleagues and I studied hospitals, and we found that on certain floors, nurses did a lot of help seeking, and on other floors, they did very little of it. And the factor that stood out on the floors where help seeking was common, where it was the norm, was there was just one nurse whose sole job it was to help other nurses on the unit. And when that role was available, nurses said, oh, it's not embarrassing, it's not vulnerable to ask for help, it's actually encouraged. Now, help-seeking isn't important just for protecting the success and the well-being of givers. It's also critical to getting more people to act like givers. Because the data say that somewhere between 75 and 90% of all giving in organizations starts with a request. But a lot of people don't ask. They don't want to look incompetent, they don't know where to turn, they don't want to burden others. And yet, if nobody ever asked for help, you have a lot of frustrated givers in your organization who would love to step up and contribute if they only knew who could benefit and how. But I think the most important thing, if you want to build a culture of successful givers, is to be thoughtful about who you let onto your team. I figured you want a culture of productive generosity, you should hire a bunch of givers. But I was surprised to discover, actually, that that was not right. That the negative impact of a taker on a culture is usually double to triple the positive impact of a giver. Think about it this way.
Okay, so that's again one of those key lines where what did he say? Whatever the line was, to say it, pause, and then say it again and pause, and give the audience a chance to digest it. Because there's a really key point of what he just said, but again, just a few seconds after he said it, I couldn't even recall what it was. So key line, say it, slow, pause, say it again, and pause, and give the audience a chance to really digest what he just said.
One bad apple can spoil a barrel, but one good egg just does not make a dozen. I don't know what that means, but I hope you do. No, let even one taker into a team, and you will see that the givers will stop helping. They'll say, I'm surrounded by a bunch of snakes and sharks, why should I contribute? Whereas if you let one giver into a team, you don't get an explosion of generosity. More often, people are like, great, that person can do all our work. So effective hiring and screening and team building is not about bringing in the givers. It's about weeding out the takers. And if you can do that well, you will be left with givers and matchers. The givers will be generous because they don't have to worry about the consequences. And the beauty of the matchers is that they follow the norm. So how do you catch a taker before it's too late? We're actually pretty bad at figuring out who's a taker, especially on first impressions. And there's a personality trait that throws us off. It's called agreeableness, one of the major dimensions of personality across cultures. Agreeable people are warm and friendly, they're nice, they're polite. You find a lot of them in Canada, where there was actually...
No, good job to pause there, because he expected some type of reaction, some type of laugh, right? So we actually find a lot of them in Canada. And that's kind of mid-sentence, so he pauses, and then he continues on there, but gives the audience, again, a chance to respond to him.
A national contest to come up with a new Canadian slogan and fill in the blank as Canadian as... And I thought the winning entry was going to be as Canadian as maple syrup or ice hockey. But no, Canadians voted for their new national slogan to be, I kid you not, as Canadian as possible under the circumstances. Now, for those of you who are highly agreeable or maybe slightly Canadian, you get this right away. How could I ever say I'm any one thing when I'm constantly adapting to try to please other people? Disagreeable people do less of it. They're more critical, skeptical, challenging, and far more likely than their peers to go to law school. That's not a joke, that's actually an empirical fact. So I always assumed that agreeable people were givers and disagreeable people were takers. But then I gathered the data and I was stunned to find no correlation between those traits. Because it turns out that agreeableness, disagreeableness is your outer veneer. How pleasant is it to interact with you? Whereas giving and taking are more of your inner motives. What are your values? What are your intentions toward others? So if you really want to judge people accurately, you have to get to the moment that every consultant in the room is waiting for and draw a 2x2.
Good line.
The agreeable givers are easy to spot. They say yes to everything. The disagreeable takers are also recognized quickly, although you might call them by a slightly different name. We forget about the other two combinations. There are disagreeable givers in our organizations. They're people who are gruff and tough on the surface, but underneath have others' best interests at heart. Or as an engineer put it, oh, disagreeable givers, like somebody with a bad user interface, but a great operating system. if that helps you. Disagreeable givers are the most undervalued people in our organizations because they're the ones who give the critical feedback that no one wants to hear, but everyone needs to hear. We need to do a much better job valuing these people as opposed to writing them off early and saying, kind of prickly, must be a selfish taker. The other combination we forget about is the deadly one, the agreeable taker, also known as the faker. This is the person who's nice to your face and then will stab you right in the back.
Okay, let's talk about this diagram. First of all, I really like the concept of showing characters or personalities that you can kind of, oh yeah, I relate to that, that makes sense, okay, I get it, it clicks. This only works though if people know who these characters are, right? So I recognize the faces, but I don't really know, I haven't really watched any of these shows, so I'm not super familiar with how this relates. Now, so some of this is gonna depend on knowing your audience. So if you know and can assume, all right, my audience is this type of person, so they're most likely, probably a high percentage of them are going to watch this certain show or this certain movie or be familiar with this, then I'm going to use all these characters from the same show or from the same movie. And so again, a lot of that comes back to your audience. So I like the idea of using the characters to personify these different personalities, but understand that if the audience doesn't understand these personalities or doesn't understand these characters, then they may be even more confused.
And my favorite way to catch these people in the interview process is to ask the question, can you give me the names of 4 people whose careers you have fundamentally improved? And the takers will give you 4 names, and they will all be more influential than them, because takers are great at kissing up and then kicking down. Givers are more likely to name people who are below them in a hierarchy, who don't have as much power, who can do them no good. And let's face it, you all know you can learn a lot about character by watching how someone treats their restaurant server or their Uber driver. So if we do all this well, if we can weed takers out of organizations, if we can make it safe to ask for help, if we can protect givers from burnout, and make it okay for them to be ambitious in pursuing their own goals, as well as trying to help other people, we can actually change the way that people define success. Instead of saying it's all about winning a competition, people will realize success is really more about contribution. I believe that the most meaningful way to succeed is to...
Now again, that's another one of those key lines of competition versus contribution, right? That's a key line there that he could dig into, maybe mold and shape that phrase a little bit better. That's the type of thing that people are gonna write down, the type of thing that people are gonna tweet, people are gonna remember and talk about. So if you find yourself that you've got a line like that, make sure that you really wordsmith that, play that line up, and then you, again, when you deliver, that you hammer it home, that it's not just kind of a throwaway line that you move on from, but whenever you say it, that you pause, and again, you give the audience a chance to process it and think about it.
Other people succeed. And if we can spread that belief, we can actually turn paranoia upside down. There's a name for that. It's called pronoia. Pronoia is the delusional belief that other people are plotting your well-being.
That's good.
That they're going around behind your back and saying exceptionally glowing things about you. And the great thing about a culture of givers is that's not a delusion, it's reality. Look, I want to live in a world where givers succeed, and I hope you will help me create that world. Thank you.
Good job. Very nice. All right, there you go. Hope you enjoyed that speech breakdown of Adam Grant's TED Talk. Hey, if you like this and you want to see more of this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We really appreciate it. Don't forget to like this video and comment below. Let us know what is one takeaway that you're going to apply to your next presentation or talk. All right, my friends, we'll catch you next time. You're awesome.